Thank you, Prime Minister. So we're talking about the future, and it's only fitting that we hear from Rangatahi about what they think about the issues that we face and what a just transition could look like. So I'd like to invite 4 young people to the stage, and the Prime Minister is going to return and facilitate a conversation with them. So I'd like to welcome Josh Barratt from Opunake High School, Ethan Sheaf-Morrison from New Plymouth Boys High School, Nikita Taiapa from New Plymouth Girls High School, and India Logan-Riley from Taiapa, Whatu. And I welcome the Prime Minister back as well.
Oh, kia ora, and I brought a friend as well in the form of the Honourable Megan Woods, who's our Minister for Energy and such a critical part of the conversation that we'll be having here on the stage today. And when the Just Transition Summit was pulled together, it felt completely natural that the beginning of this conversation started with the generation that we ultimately are responsible to. Because if we don't act, it's our next generation who pick up the pieces. And so I'm not going to speak any further. I'm going to instead hand over to the 4 young people who are sitting before us, who I know have some questions for us, and we'll do our best to answer them. So who would like to begin?
With any change as drastic as this, there's going to be pushback. So how can businesses be held accountable if they're not striving towards a low emissions economy?
And a fantastic question, because this is actually one of the debates that's been sparked over the introduction of the Zero Carbon Bill. You know, how do we make sure that everyone's accountable, government in particular, but also, as has been said, government can't do absolutely everything to reach these goals alone. So how do we hold business accountable, individual consumers? I still think that one of the most important things that we can do is try and build that consensus. Because in a democracy, anything that can be built can be undone. Parliament is always sovereign over its own decisions, and so even when we set up architecture around climate change, any government of the day could unravel that. Now, I still remember as a brand new MP coming into Parliament and watching as Parliament resumed with new leadership, and the ETS scheme was changed. Legislation on biofuels was changed. And so I still think one of the most important things we can do is build consensus. And when you think about the things that we have consensus on in New Zealand, things like universal pension, sure, we tinker around the edges, but that fundamentally stays the same because we know the public would not accept the alternative. We have to get to a position, and young people have been critical in this, the climate strikes were an example, of making sure that it becomes utterly unacceptable not to act on climate change and not to follow through on our commitments on climate change, and therefore for it to be unacceptable for business not to do the same. So I think honestly, that is the most important thing that we can do.
I guess you sort of already talked about it, but as Taranaki leans to more of a green energy region, what can we expect from oil and gas? Does it become completely irrelevant in the future? And what type of particular energies can we expect, not only in Taranaki, but across the entire country? And following on from that, what type of job influx and to what expense is it for consumers and just people around?
3-part question. Speaker in Parliament would totally rule that out, but I'm going to extend. You're right to ask that question, and this is ultimately what's given rise to this discussion and debate here. What does the future look like when we have an economy that such a significant part over the years has been oil and gas? Well, ultimately we've said it needs to be a transition, and during the course of that transition we need to make sure we utilise the skills that already exist in this region. The engineering businesses that exist here, how can we channel that into opportunities around, for instance, green hydrogen? And that's an area in hydrogen where we've been doing a lot of work with with local government here and regional economic development, who's done some incredible planning around the hydrogen future for New Zealand and Taranaki. But it is a transition. You know, we haven't turned things off overnight because we don't want to see the jarring effects of just making a sudden decision because we have to. Minister, do you want to add?
And to answer the second leg of your question, I think one of the important things you talked about in terms was the skills. So one of the things in the transition that we're planning, what the Prime Minister talked about in terms we need to think about what the expertise that exists in this region, and we know that's around energy, we know it's around engineering, and most of the people that are working in the industry today will finish their careers in the industry. But for people such as yourselves, this fits very much within our future of work planning that Minister Robertson will talk about later on today. This is about what are the skills that young people are going to need as they're thinking about what jobs they're going to do in the future for some of those new opportunities in green hydrogen. But also one of the exciting things about the energy sector in the 21st century is that it's about decentralisation, it's about digitisation, it's all those kind of skills that will be transferable across different parts of the economy. So that's what we have to be thinking about as a government too. What is the kind of skills training we're setting up for you?
What role do you think Māori environmental values will play in the 2050 transition?
So just in case anyone didn't hear that, the question was around Māori values in the transition. And I was actually thinking, just yesterday, I was watching a video that was played at the beginning of the announcement around the zero carbon bill. And the Ministry for the Environment had interviewed Ngārimu Blair of Ngāti Whātua. And he made this comment that really stuck with me. He said, what if we had decades ago, really applied the value of kaitiakitanga? What if we had really taken on board that idea of us being guardians, that we ultimately have a period of time for which we have a guardianship role over the environment, which we are ultimately then handing on, and looking at our obligations through that lens, how we would have done things differently. And so that value for me probably sums up so much of what we need to do in terms of our environmental management going forward, truly feeling that sense of responsibility and that duty of care. There's also, I think, the value of whanaungatanga and the relationship we have with the environment as well. When you think about an area like Whanganui, I have a whakatauki there, I am the river and the river is me. That link that I think actually New Zealanders, generally speaking, feel to their environment, translating that real connection that we have with place into the way that we treat our environment. Now, we're trying to do that. How does that translate into policy? Well, we're thinking about that in the way that we have constructed our next budget. So the 2019 budget, we've called it a wellbeing budget because I think really for the first time we're saying you can't think about everything in separate compartments. Often budgets and governments just think about GDP. And I've said this a number of times. Robert Kennedy once said, GDP measures just about everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And yet when we release budgets, so often we're just looking at those economic indicators. But as Grant Robertson, our Minister of Finance, often says, if you have a business that's doing well and it's contributing to the economy and productivity and so on, that might look good on paper, but what if that business is polluting its local river and the person that owns that business has a child who is suffering from mental health issues? Now, none of that is captured in the way that we usually mark success in our economy, and we've got to change that. Our well-being needs to look at the health of our environment. It needs to look at the well-being of our people, and of course it needs to look at how our economy is going, but all of them are linked. And so ultimately I think that does hark back to Māori values we would have done well to pay heed to a long time ago.
Tēnā kōrua. I think my question is particularly relevant after you've announced these new phases of development as we make this shift. So particularly given that the government just announced a block offer of land for fossil fuel exploration without the consent of mana whenua, what is the government going to do by the next election that will make sure that our right to determine what happens on land that we're kaitiaki of is actually upheld as safeguarded by Te Tiriti? And how will that look better than consultation and engagement?
And I think, you've really captured actually what has been, the heart of this debate. When we announced the decision around ending new offshore block offers, we did also say we would continue onshore. And that was part of the positioning of saying that we know things need to change, but we want to do it in a planned way. And so I know the offshore decision was really welcomed by some. It was not welcomed by others. The onshore continuation, again, welcomed by some, not welcomed by others. And this has been, one of the difficult issues for us as a government in deciding that we wanted to move into that transition, the hard decisions. I will ask the Minister to speak to some of the specifics, but one thing I do also want to say around just generally government's relationship with Māori, we recognise that for a long time these ideas of engagement have simply been through tick box exercises of consultation. One of the things we've recognised is actually that when we move into a post-treaty settlement phase, actually that relationship, we need to keep changing that, and it needs to be much, much more of a connection. We created Te Arawhiti. Now Te Arawhiti, for me, is that when we go into a environment where we no longer have the Office of Treaty Settlements, that we start looking then instead at that Crown Māori relationship. And Te Arawhiti means the bridge. And that is the kind of relationship we need to build, where instead of the Crown waiting on one side for Māori to come over, we do a lot more of walking over. And so that fundamentally needs to change, and we've acknowledged that. But let me give a specific answer on this block offer that I know you're interested in.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and I think you've covered a lot of it. I think one of the important things when we went ahead with Block Offer 2018 is it was largely under the legislation as it stands. We made some immediate changes to the legislation last year to enable us not to do an offshore block offer. And that meant that it was pretty much business as usual in the way iwi had been consulted with and throughout the history of that legislation. And I know that we did rule out some areas under the petroleum program around Parihaka, Urupa, the kinds of areas that obviously we do need to rule out. One of the things that we did do a bit differently in this block offer was also rule out conservation land around the block offer. But this is an interim measure. What we've always said is we've done the immediate changes to the block offer, but we're coming back to do round two of looking at the Crown Minerals Act, which is the legislation that covers off how it is that we allocate rights for exploration. So what I would do is encourage everybody who feels strongly about that to take part in that consultation when we do round two, about how in the future, in the 21st century, you want local iwi to be involved in this conversation, what a modern conversation with iwi around this looks like. One of the things that I think the exciting thing about the conversation we're going to have in this room over the next 2 days, we're world leading on the conversation of how we do this transition. And I think something we can offer to the world of how it is that we bring the Indigenous voice into that conversation, and we can show the rest of the world what that looks like in an Aotearoa New Zealand context. So I really encourage that conversation, and I want to hear those views coming through really strongly, so thank you for bringing it up.
The little red clicker says we've got 1 minute 55, so let's squeeze in an extra question.
Okay.
Let's freestyle now, everyone.
How are you going to ensure that Māori involvement goes further than just consultation?
I think it probably in part it really also comes down to at what point you're starting those conversations. If you've already made a decision, and this is one of the issues that the Minister's raising, some of that process is actually legislated, and so we go through a formal process that's being set down and it's just the way it's been done, but often it means that decisions are made and then we take those decisions out and we ask for people's opinion on it. So really actually beginning right at the start, that fundamentally changes the nature, becomes a much different conversation if decisions haven't already been made, for instance. 1 minute.
How can we, people I can tell asking around are scared of what will happen because they rely on oil and gas and high emission economies. What are some ways, well, one way I guess, we could alleviate that fear a little bit?
That is such a good question. And it's such a hard balance, isn't it? Whenever we're having the climate debate, the natural inclination is to show everyone it's a crisis, because we want people to feel the need, that sense of urgency. And so we throw up the images of what's happening to the glaciers, and we throw up the wildfires. And look, in New Zealand we've got our own images now of those extreme weather events. So that's our natural inclination, and it does create a sense of panic and urgency, and something I don't think I'd fully appreciated. That's creating a huge sense of anxiety for our young people, because every time they see those images butted up against climate inaction, they're wondering what's going to happen to their future. So equally, people then feel that sense of similar panic. Okay, well, if it's so urgent, does that mean my entire life is going to have to change? Either the things that I do now will have to change, or actually the price of me doing what I do now will inflate so much that I will suffer. The hard path that we all have to walk is creating that sense of urgency, but also optimism. Now, I feel both. Yes, it's absolutely real. We have to act now, but in acting now, we can try and alleviate some of the fear that we'll do it in such a jarring way that people will really feel that huge financial toll on them. In fact, the goal that we set yesterday, the targets that are part of the Zero Carbon Bill, we already have a set of expectations, international obligations we've signed up to. We've taken us a little bit further because we've said 1.5 degrees should be our goal. Not everyone is doing that, but we are, because we are members of the Pacific, and we need to be able to look our Pacific neighbours in the eye. And if we don't aim for 1.5, we're essentially saying that we accept they will lose some of their territory due to climate change. So we're opting for 1.5 because that also means that we protect flora and fauna that would otherwise disappear at 2 degrees. And in accepting 1.5, actually we're adding roughly potentially a cost to growth of about 0.2%. That's not taking into account that actually there's a whole range of growth opportunities out of clean tech, out of the potential IP we could create by investing in agricultural solutions that we are focused on now, but the rest of the world will probably be focused on in the next few years. In fact, when I had one of my first conversations with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, when I became Prime Minister, we started talking about climate change. He said, yes, tell me, what are you doing? Because we are all searching for ideas, and if we lead on those ideas, produce those ideas early, find that technology, we will benefit economically from that. That will mean jobs, it will mean a lower cost transition, and it will mean people can feel hopeful. And so feel urgent, feel that sense of urgency, but please also feel optimistic as well. And we'll perhaps, I'm a negative 2.35 now, so perhaps we'll end on that note, but thank you for coming and asking us real questions.